All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Friday, everybody. Hope all of you guys had a great week. Got a jam-packed show for you today. Got a little bit of NBA news today. Joel Embiid has signed a 3-year, $193 million maximum extension. So he's now locked up for the next 5 years at an average annual salary of $60 million. So we're going to talk about that a little bit off the top. And then we're continuing with our power rankings today with number 14 through number 12, season preview style. So we'll be doing season previews on the New Orleans Pelicans, the Golden State Warriors, and the Indiana Pacers. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. Don't forget it's also helpful if you leave a rating and a review on that front. And then last but not least, keep dropping mailbag questions in the YouTube comments so we can keep hitting them throughout the remainder of this year. All right, let's talk some basketball. So the Joel Embiid extension, 3 years, $193 million. Locked up for 5 years at an average annual salary of $60 million. And there's a couple of different angles to look at this from. I understand why Daryl Morey and the Sixers did this. The Sixers have been a disappointing team, right? They haven't achieved as much as certainly people in Philly have hoped for over the course of this last few years, right? And it got a little weird last year, right? Like we had Joel Embiid showing up with Paul George to a playoff broadcast before that deal was done, which is like a legitimate, like kind of passive aggressive type of pressure move to be like, we need more firepower, right? And it's been a weird saga over the course of the Embiid experience, right? Like we had the whole Ben Simmons thing and how that went south. Obviously, Joel Embiid was very fond of Jimmy Butler and wanted him, and then he ended up getting Tobias Harris ended up getting preferred over Jimmy Butler over the course of that summer, which ended up being something that Joel Embiid did some passive aggressive stuff kind of surrounding that move, right? So you're basically, it seems as though you're one bad season away from potentially a trade demand, right? So locking up Joel Embiid helps that in two ways. One, it's a gesture of good faith, right? You're offering an enormous amount of money to Joel Embiid after the specific season where most of your concerns about Embiid's floor came to the surface, right? Between him not even playing half the season and not being able to get his team out of the first round and looking like he was wearing down at the end of those Knicks games, right? So like it's an act of good faith after a season like that to offer him such a massive guarantee. That builds cachet in that relationship, right? And then the second piece of it is it makes his contract borderline untradeable in the sense that even if Embiid were to request a trade, it would be difficult to find willing trade partners at that point, which almost kind of further anchors Joel Embiid in Philly, right? But I also understand the NBA fan base at large and how they would look at this and be like, what the hell are you guys doing? Because now you have, on average, for the next 4 years, over $110 million guaranteed tied up in Paul George and Joel Embiid. Two players who are notoriously hurt all the time. I pulled this stat this morning. In the last 5 years combined, for those two guys, so 10 total seasons, they've reached 60 games 3 times between the two of them combined over the last 5 years. They're notoriously unavailable, and with exception of little short bursts, both of them notoriously seem to go down a significant level in terms of their winning impact when they get to the postseason, right? So, like, I think that's fair criticism. And I understand how people from the outside looking in would say that. But this is where we have to be honest about the reality of this situation. The Sixers are in the Joel Embiid business. There's really no version of that business that doesn't carry an enormous amount of risk. There's just as much risk in not extending him. Because then what if he does end up requesting a trade? What if he does end up testing free agency? There's risk there as well. Even if you were to offer him a lower extension, like, hey, we want to lock you up for 5 years, but we're not going to come in at that super max number. Let's see if we can come in somewhere lower. That could just insult the guy, and now you're in the same boat, right? There was risk in not going after Paul George this summer. It's very possible that if you do nothing this summer, you end up in the same type of situation where Joel Embiid is unhappy and potentially requests a trade. I'm sure if you injected truth serum into Daryl Morey and asked him, like, would you prefer to build around a star who always plays 75 games and consistently goes up a level in the postseason? I'm sure he would. But that's not the deck of cards that Daryl Morey has been dealt. He took over as general manager of a team that is built around Joel Embiid. When you're building around Joel Embiid, there is inherent risk there. And as soon as you go out of the Joel Embiid business, let's say you traded him this summer, before you extended him, when he's more tradable, then you immediately lose all relevance. I like Tyrese Maxey, good young player. But you're not getting Paul George without Joel Embiid. And without Paul George or Joel Embiid, you're a basement of the Eastern Conference type of team. So, I get it how from the outside looking in, we might look at it and go, man, $110 million guaranteed for the next 4 years on average annually tied up in two players that routinely miss like at least a third of the season and both struggle in the playoffs. I get why from the outside looking in that looks tricky, but if I was GM of the 76ers, I think I'd probably do the same thing. Because as soon as you've decided we're building around Joel Embiid, this is kind of the reality of how this works. So, to put it simply, Daryl Morey has made an extremely risky series of moves this summer, but his franchise is built around the riskiest star in the league. So it's kind of just the reality of the way you have to do business when you're building around Joel. And there's another side to this coin that you have to factor in when you're having this conversation. As of right now, on DraftKings, the Sixers have the third best odds to win the title. Now, I don't have them quite that high, but I have them very high. And I have consistently said that Joel Embiid is one of the small handful of players in the NBA who is capable of legitimately going on a wrecking ball tour and just kicking everybody's ass and getting the trophy. Most GMs aren't building around stars that have that type of upside. So maybe those GMs can be more risk averse, but they're not winning the trophy anytime soon, right? Embiid is 30 years old. He has this short window here, probably in that 30 to 33 age, where maybe if everything goes right, you can win the title. After that, you're fucked anyway. He's been hurt way too many times. The wear and tear and everything on his body, he's not the kind of guy that's going to be good at 37, 38 years old. So there is no long-term window here anyway. This is very much a short, get it while you can type of window. So you might as well put all the support you possibly can behind him and see if you can get it done. The last example I would use for this is, remember the Kawhi trade to Toronto? And again, it's not exactly the same type of comparison, but it has some similarities in the sense that everyone around the league knew Kawhi wanted to go to Los Angeles. Everyone around the league knew if you traded for Kawhi that year and you weren't one of the LA teams, that it was a one-year rental. There was that tiny little crack of hope, maybe if you just wow him, he might stay. But you can't do any better than Toronto did that summer anyway, and he still left. But here's the thing. Toronto made the trade. Kawhi did leave. And Toronto's been bad ever since. But they have the Larry O'Brien trophy. And that shit is forever. So if I'm Daryl Morey, we all know how Daryl Morey does business too. He's got his algorithm where he basically calculates a percentage chance that he thinks his team has to win the title. And most of his decision making is geared towards trying to increase that percentage. There's a lot of potential bad outcomes for the Sixers this year. We all know that. Maybe Paul George plays 50 games and Embiid plays 45 games and they end up in the 5th or 6th seed and they lose a first round series. Maybe that's what happens. But there's also a legitimate pathway here that ends in them holding the trophy. They're a lot closer to the trophy than most of the teams in the league. So, once we acknowledge that they're in the high-risk, high-reward business, I think these moves make a lot of sense. You needed to substantially improve Embiid's supporting cast this summer. Going after Paul George was the only real way to do that. You need to cement Joel Embiid in Philly to make it so that you have multiple years to try to make this work. Extending him was the best chance to do that. And if I was GM of the Sixers, I would have done the same thing. So I think like it's easy to look at other situations around the league and to be like, that situation's better. That situation's better. And you might be right. But Daryl Morey doesn't have the luxury of just cherry picking which situation he wants to be in. He's in Philly. He's got to deal with Philly's hand of cards. And I think these are the right moves within that context. TD Tutty taking it to the house, in for 6, whatever you call a touchdown. One thing's for sure. Touchdowns matter more at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. On the ground, in the air, from the special teams or defense, we don't care how they score them. We want to bet on touchdowns, and DraftKings Sportsbook is delivering. Ready to place your first bet? Try betting on something simple like picking a player to score a touchdown or how many TDs will be in a game. Go to DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. The game I have my eye on this week is Ravens-Cowboys. I think both teams need that game badly. I'm a Cowboys fan too. Very predictable start to the season for the Cowboys, but really, really excited for this weekend. Ready to do a touchdown dance of your own? New DraftKings customers bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big with DraftKings Sportsbook, the #1 place to bet touchdowns. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code HOOPS. That's HOOPS. That's code HOOPS for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. All right, let's get into our season previews, starting with number 14, the New Orleans Pelicans. A lot of turnover for them this summer. They lose Dyson Daniels, Najee Marshall, Larry Nance Jr., Jonas Valanciunas, and Cody Zeller. They had Javonte Green, an athletic wing who played for Chicago last year. Daniel Tice. They drafted Yves Missy in the late first round. He's like an athletic center prospect. And then the major move this summer, they traded for DeJounte Murray, obviously giving up in that deal Dyson Daniels and Larry Nance Jr., as well as some draft compensation. He's one of my favorite players in the league and a guy that I desperately wanted the Lakers to get and a guy that I think Pelicans fans will love. So when we're talking about next season, let's start with DeJounte. DeJounte brings an element to the Pelicans backcourt that they didn't have. Zion obviously brings like real downhill force to his game. But Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum didn't. Or don't, I should say. They're still on the roster. They are finesse pull-up shooters. They can get to the rim. Brandon Ingram got to the rim plenty, mostly as part of screening actions. When the coverage has the ability for them to get by their defender and get into the basket area, those guys can take advantage of that. But they're not like face up with really good perimeter defenders and get dribble penetration type of guys. That's not what Brandon and CJ do. DeJounte's really good at that. DeJounte can beat good perimeter defenders off the dribble straight up. But he also has the same type of counter in pull-up jump shooting situations that Brandon and CJ had. Brandon and CJ both shot 45% on pull-up jump shots last year. DeJounte Murray shot 45% on pull-up jump shots last year. There were 16 players in the NBA that attempted at least 500 pull-up jump shots last year. DeJounte's 1.03 points per possession ranked 8th on that list. He was a good, efficient, high-volume pull-up jump shooter. He was more efficient on pull-up jump shots than Damian Lillard was last year. So, like, there's a real drive and kick kind of element with DeJounte that you can get in terms of beating people off the dribble and getting people into rotation while also bringing that over-the-top shot making that has become a staple of what has made the Pelicans good over the years, right? He made the 5th most clutch shots in the entire NBA last year because of his ability to knock down shots over the top. He's also a good passer. He averaged 6 assists per game playing next to Trae Young. His last season in San Antonio before he came over to Atlanta, he averaged 9.2 assists with just 2.6 turnovers. That's awesome. And more importantly, He just had the best off-ball season of his career. He converted spot-ups at 1.15 points per possession. That's in the 79th percentile. Out of the 37 players in the league to log at least 300 spot-up possessions, he ranked 11th. That's really, really good. And that's something that used to be a weakness of his. Now, I know there's some hesitancy surrounding him on the defensive end of the floor, and there's some reality there. Like, he was an all-defense caliber guard when he was in San Antonio. Wasn't like that in Atlanta. But I'm a big believer in basketball culture, and Atlanta did not have a defensive-minded culture. And so this is a Pelicans team that was top 10 in defense last year. It's part of the identity organizationally from the top down. If you get buy-in again, and then there's also just the sheer amount of offensive talent on this team. When you have Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum, there's just a lot more ball handling and playmaking ability on this team than Atlanta had, which was a traditional 4 out, 1 in, your turn, my turn type of offense between two guys. There's going to be more resources that DeJounte can devote to that end of the floor. But yeah, like if you're asking me, what are some of the swing factors around this deal as to whether or not it'll work extremely well or not as well? One of those major swing factors is going to be, does DeJounte defend the way that he's capable of? And that's totally fair to bring up. But I do think that New Orleans is more set up to accentuate that part of DeJounte's game. I think New Orleans has a chance to be a devastating drive and kick team. If they utilize Zion at the beginning of possessions to pressure the rim and make kickout passes, and by the way, DeJounte can do the same thing. There's now 2 layers to that. They have incredible spot-up talent. DeJounte Murray, 1.15 points per spot-up possession. That's insanely good. CJ McCollum, 1.32 points per spot-up possession. That was one of the best marks in the league last year. Trey Murphy, 1.18. Brandon Ingram, 1.08. That's solid. Herb Jones, 1.09. That's solid. The Pelicans as a team last year were second in spot-up efficiency in the entire league, and you just added another guy who can both capitalize on spot-up situations and pressure the rim consistently. I think it's a legitimate offensive upgrade. Now, where it gets weird is, how does this all fit together, right? Where does Brandon Ingram fit into this? How do you start constructing lineups? There's a lot of talk because Daniel Tice is the only proven NBA center on the roster right now, and he's basically a backup, right? There's a lot of talk of Zion starting at center. If they start Zion at center, your lineup is CJ McCollum, DeJounte Murray, Herb Jones, Brandon Ingram, and Zion Williamson. Like, that's a ton of offensive skill, obviously coming with some downsides, right? Very small and weak defensively on that front line with your forwards. But on the other end of the floor, you're going to be very fast and borderline impossible to guard in space. There's a give and a take, right? So, like, I think it's worth trying. Throw it out there for 20, 30 games. See what happens. If it ends up being an absolute disaster and your defense is not good enough and the offense isn't enough to make up for that gap, then you can get more aggressive about trying to make some sort of consolidation trade and try to turn one of these guys like CJ or BI into somebody that you can use on that front line to anchor those units. But I think it's worth giving a try. And I think there's enough talent there that even if you dropped some games, like if you lost to Denver or you lost to like another big physical front line like the Lakers because you just don't have that size on the front line, but you're still, 15-7 because your offense is incredible and you beat the shit out of everyone else, like, that's fine. You're floating along. That's a decision that you can make and deal with in February. I mean, the Knicks are in the same boat with this Julius Randle thing. It's like, yeah, it's a little clunky. Don't know how he fits in the grand scheme of things, but like, what's the rush? Send them all out there. Let them hoop. See what happens. Basketball is more art than science. I talk about this all the time. And like, sometimes you just put a bunch of guys together and it just magically comes together. And all of a sudden it's like, holy shit, what are we watching? And like, and when you've got this kind of talent, it's at least worth throwing these guys out there and just seeing what happens. Now, on the defensive end, it is hard to build any sort of traditional look without a real defensive anchor. A guy that can defend in ball screens in some way, whether it's a high drop or a deep drop or whatever it is that you want to do. And then that can also help control the defensive glass. It's challenging to do without a real center. But there is talent there. You have a lot of length. You have a lot of speed, especially on the perimeter, right? You got a lot of guys that can guard at the point of attack. So like if you don't have a giant guy underneath the basket that can drop in ball screens and defend or grab defensive rebounds, then as a team, you have to positionally be ready to protect the paint. What that means is, one, you got to contain the basketball and control dribble penetration. Another way you could do that too, by switching ball screens, you can shut off dribble penetration. But it's going to be so much more important on the backside for guys to make their rotations quickly. Because if you're going to protect the rim, it's not going to be vertically because you don't have real interior size. It's got to be positionally, meaning it's about guys on the backside. When people do get beat off the dribble, those guys have to be quick and precise in their rotations and positionally put themselves between the ball handler and the rim, where they can either take a charge or at least force that guy to veer off into a different direction, right? So it's going to be a really difficult job. And then on the defensive glass, everyone's got to fly around. Everyone's got to box out. Everyone's got to crack down from the wings. And then the last piece of it is when you have opportunities to use that speed against interior size, you have to take advantage of it. That's spreading teams out and kicking them to death. And then when you see opportunities to get out and transition and beat slow-footed bigs up the floor. Again, like we always talk about styles make fights, but it's usually which style wins the fight. If there's a big team playing against a small team, if the big team is better at doing big guy stuff than the small team is at doing small guy stuff, then the big team will win and everyone will be like, man, they're just too small to guard us. But if the small team does more small guy stuff and does it more impactfully than the big team does, then you'll come out of that game and you'll be like, man, they're just too slow for us. Those are the pushes and pulls that you have to win. That said, like this was a team last year that was top 10 in defense and top 10 in rebounding. I'm not sure if they can get there without a real starting center in the fold. So it feels like this inevitably ends with Brandon Ingram being traded for front court depth, but it's just really hard to find willing trade partners there. So this is like a really funky team that's built around a very funky traditional or non-traditional, I should say, foundational star in Zion. So it's really hard to predict what the Pelicans are going to look like this year. Right now, I'm going to say a play-in team. But this team has a very wide range of outcomes for the season. And I think the Pelicans are on the short list of teams that I think we're going to learn the most about in the first month or so of the season. All right, next, number 13, the Golden State Warriors. A little bit of roster turnover. They lost Chris Paul, Dario Saric, and Klay Thompson. They added Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, and DeAnthony Melton. The offseason for the Warriors actually reminds me a lot of the 2022 offseason in that you're finding discounted role players, but not necessarily that are more talented than what you have, but that just fit Warriors basketball better, right? Like that 2021 team that was like Kelly Oubre and Kent Bazemore and Brad Wanamaker. It's not like those guys are demonstrably better than Otto Porter, right? Or Nemanja Bjelica. It's more just that those guys fit better into what Golden State was trying to do, right? That's what I like about these three guys. Kyle Anderson, very good defensive forward. He can play both on and off the ball. Of all of the guys that Minnesota tried on Luka Doncic in the conference finals, I thought Kyle was by far their best option. He's particularly good at bigger forwards that like to use size and strength to get to spots, but he's also a good off-ball player. He's got great length. He's a very smart defender. And then on the offensive end, I think he'll thrive as a playmaker in Golden State's system. He had 4.2 assists to just 1.2 turnovers last year. He was one of only 14 players in the entire NBA to play at least 20 minutes per game, but to log an assist to turnover ratio of at least 3.5 to 1. He's an efficient playmaker. And as we know, in Golden State's system, they usually have two dribble handoff fulcrums that are non-shooters when they're flowing from side to side with action, right? Draymond will dribble over into a dribble handoff with Pajemski or Steph coming off one side, and then that guy comes off and throws a swing pass to the second guy, usually Looney or Trace Jackson Davis or something like that. And it's like that guy turns and he runs the next dribble handoff. And usually one of those guys ends up drawing their screen defender out onto the ball handler, Steph or Pods or Clay or whoever it was last year. And then there's a slip opportunity there, and then that guy needs to make plays. Or if Kyle Anderson, in this case, is dribbling at that second side action and the defender's top locking, meaning that defender is not allowing the use of the screen, he's forcing a back cut, you need a guy that can consistently make those back cut passes. I think Kyle Anderson's going to do that really, really well. He scored well on the roll last year. He got 1.27 points per possession on roll man possessions. That's very good. And he's also just a good ball handler in general. I'm actually going to be really curious to see if the Warriors run more inverted ball screens with Steph as the screener. They did a little bit of this over the last few years with Andrew Wiggins, but Anderson is a better decision maker and a better ball handler in that spot. And so I'm actually really curious to see if we get a lot of that where it's like Kyle Anderson dribbling the ball while Steph just screens for him. Because Steph's man is not going to help on a Kyle Anderson drive. And so if he does, Steph's going to get wide open on the slip. And if he doesn't, Kyle's going to turn the corner and get right downhill to the rim. As soon as Kyle gets right downhill to the rim, because the guy setting the screen's not helping Kyle's defender, he's going to get downhill and be able to wreak havoc as a playmaker at that point. I think it's going to be a really useful player on a discounted deal. Buddy Hield. Klay Thompson last year gave you 18 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists on 58% true shooting. And he had his worst defensive season in a long time, and he wasn't very impactful on the glass. Buddy Hield, 12 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists on 58% true shooting, but he played fewer minutes. If you extrapolate both players out to per 36, Klay was about 22 points per 36 minutes. Buddy was at about 17. So not quite the amount of scoring production. Here's a couple more key numbers for you guys. Klay Thompson, 1.10 points per possession in off-screen situations, 1.09 points per possession in spot-up situations, 1.11 points per jump shot. Buddy Hield, 0.87 points per possession off screen, so not as efficient, but he was much, much lower volume. He was doing a lot of like ghost screens for Tyrese Haliburton, which register actually as roll man possessions on Synergy. But that was like one of Indiana's most impactful actions last year, and it still functions essentially as like a movement shot in a screening action. And then 1.01 points per possession in spot-up situations. That's pretty mediocre. But he did shoot the ball well, 1.11 points per jump shot. So here's the thing. Buddy's smaller, and he's overall a less impactful movement shooter than Klay is. But Buddy Hield is 3 years younger and costs about half as much in guaranteed money. Also, Klay Thompson is very clearly on the downslope and had his first big drop-off last year. It was his first time failing to hit 20 points per game since 2014. It was his worst defensive rebounding season since 2014. And overall, I thought he struggled defensively last year. So essentially, you got a player who can roughly approximate what Klay Thompson does with about half as much guaranteed money and less risk of age-related decline. The other part of it, too, is I think he's more willing to accept a smaller bench role, right? Like Klay, even in his bench games, still played about 29 minutes per game. There were only 3 times all season last year that Klay Thompson did not play 20 minutes. The last day of the regular season against the Jazz in a game they didn't need him. The 52-point loss against Boston, because everyone was sitting the bench in the second half. And then the Minnesota game, where he got ejected in the first couple of minutes. That's it. Because Klay was like under the expectation that he needed to play a lot. And there would have been issues if Steve Kerr cut his minutes way down. And they needed him to play for what it's worth. But like if there was a reason to play someone else, Kerr wasn't going that route. Not in any sort of like substantial sample size, that is. Now, you'll be able to get away with like heavily oscillating Buddy Hield's minutes from high to low based on the matchup without having to worry about fallout in team chemistry. I think that's an advantage. So like, obviously you don't want to lose Klay, but if you're going to, you did pretty well to try to replace that archetype. And there's another element to that. DeAnthony Melton, another guy who plays a similar position, a rock solid starting caliber guard when he's healthy. Going back to his 2023 season, that was the last time he was healthy. He played 77 games. He actually played 70-plus games in each of the 2 seasons before last year. So if you're looking for optimism around DeAnthony Melton's health, you could hope that last year was an outlier in recent years. But DeAnthony Melton in 2023, 1.12 points per spot up possession. That's really good. He was an efficient on-ball creator. He ran 248 pick and rolls for 259 points. That's 1.04 points per possession, including passes. That's really good. He's a high-level jump shooter. He shot 39% from 3 on 5 attempts per game. 1.13 points per possession overall on jump shots. He shot 41% on catch-and-shoot jump shots in that 2023 year. And he can knock down jump shots off the dribble. He hit like 40 or 50. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. But he hit a bunch of pull-up jump shots that year as well. I've talked about this a lot, but I view him as like a slightly poor man's version of Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, but with more off-the-dribble pop. And that's like the main difference. KCP is more of like a movement shooter. DeAnthony Melton is a guy that can actually like put the ball on the floor and make plays. I think he's a guy that's actually going to have some success running action coming off of screens in Golden State's system. He rebounds well for a guard. He's a good point of attack defender. I think he's just a rock solid player, provided that he's healthy. So as long as he is healthy, that to me is a big get. So you got 3 quality rotation players, all for about $30 million annually combined, all on easily tradable contracts. So like, given the lack of options that were available to Golden State this summer, I actually thought they did about as well as you possibly can, while maintaining their ability to make a move during the season. Now, looking at last year's team, I actually thought the Warriors performed well relative to the talent they had on the roster. They won 46 games. They finished 9th in offensive rating. That is a testament to Steph Curry's greatness, because given the talent on that roster for them to finish top 10 in offense, even during Steph's slump to end the year, his final 25 games, in that span, they were 8th in offense, which just goes to show you how impactful Steph is offensively just when he's running around, even when he's not making shots. He can fuel an above average offense with below average talent, even without making shots. That's incredible. But it was abundantly clear throughout the year last year that the Warriors were not as good as their record showed. Like, they were 24-5 against teams that were below 500. That's the same record that Oklahoma City had against teams that were 500 or below 500, I should say. So they took care of business against the bad teams. But they were just 9-21 against teams that were in the top 10 in point differential, according to Cleaning the Glass. They had a minus 2.7 net rating. So they got outscored by 2.7 points per 100 possessions in those matchups. That ranked 22nd in the NBA. Charlotte, Memphis, San Antonio, Portland, Utah, Detroit, Atlanta, and Chicago all had better net ratings against teams in the top 10 in point differential last year than Golden State did. So that screams to me, this team doesn't have enough talent, but has excellent leadership. Because anytime a win was realistically achievable, those guys got the job done through excellent coaching and leadership from Steph Curry. But when they ran into teams with real firepower, they got exposed for being a roster with severe limitations. So that to me is like a special shout out to Steve Kerr and Steph Curry last year, because given the circumstances, given the Draymond suspension, given the amount of talent they had around them, that looks like a 35-win team to me, and they got 46 wins. So, like, I thought they squeezed that sponge for everything it was worth last year. And that's why it's so dumb every single time we do the whole, like, oh, they missed the playoffs thing. It's like, usually there's reasons for that. And, like, look, Steph didn't play very well down the tail end of the season, but it wasn't for lack of trying. He was leaving it out there every single night. This wasn't like, you know, Luka in last year, the year before the final run, where at the tail end of the year, every time you watched him on TV, it was an eyesore. Like, they were trying like hell to get in. They just didn't have the talent to get it done. So we talked about the 3 new free agent signings this summer. Let's talk about what needs to happen in-house for the Warriors to return to the middle tier of the Western Conference, to get back in with those groups, that group that has like Dallas and Minnesota and the Lakers and Memphis and all those teams in the middle of the West. How do they get back into that group? I have 3 things. 1, Brandon Podziemski needs to take the next leap as a shot creator. He had an awesome rookie season. Finished 5th in Rookie of the Year voting. He shot the ball well. He was Golden State's second best on-off guy in terms of differential behind Draymond. They were 6.2 points per 100 possessions better with Podziemski on the floor versus off the floor. He was an excellent fit in their 5-out offensive attack. He made good decisions consistently. He kept the ball moving. And he's already a solid defensive player at the guard position. But Golden State needs more offensive production out of that off-guard spot in support of Steph. Pods got over 15 points in a game just 9 times last season. And it really comes down to just being more aggressive. And I get it, for the record. I get it in his circumstance why he didn't come in as a rookie into the Golden State damn Warriors and just start jacking up shots. I get it. I'm not blaming him for last year. I'm talking about what he needs to do moving forward. He shot over 40% on 102 pull-up jump shots last year, and a bunch of them were threes. So he was at 1.12 points per pull-up jump shot. That's insane. As a matter of fact, out of the 135 players to attempt at least 100 pull-up jump shots, Pods ranked 8th out of 135 guys in efficiency. I actually view that as a bad stat, and the main reason why is it means he's being too picky. He needs to take more of them. He needs to take more pull-up jump shots, and he needs to take more floaters. Those are the 2 shots that I think when he's getting downhill on screens and he sees opportunities to get to that floater, he needs to take it more, and just every time he gets a little bit of separation, he needs to let that thing fly off the dribble. Brandon Podziemski averaged 20 points per game at Santa Clara. He's got real scoring chops, and I think that this team actually needs him to unleash them. When I talk to Warriors guys that cover the league, there's a lot of buzz. There's some disagreement about Podziemski. There's some guys that aren't very high on him, but the people that I trust are actually very high on him. The people that watch him every day think he has legitimate all-star upside. And I just want to see how much closer he can get to that in this season. 2, Jonathan Kuminga needs to learn how to channel his abilities more consistently in a winning context. Kuminga showed real scoring upside last year. He had 23 20-point games, did a lot of damage in transition, and in those baseline cuts out of that classic Golden State tic-tac-toe where Steph draws 2, short roll man, baseline defender steps over, Kuminga cuts out of the baseline and gets a dunk. A lot of stuff like that. But he also showed real upside as a post scorer. He was consistently getting around his defender or just going through his defender. He was getting to the foul line a bunch. Really, the main thing that nuked his efficiency in the post was turnovers. He turned the ball over on 13% of his post-ups, which was to be expected. Start the year, he's getting a lot of single coverage. He was cooking everybody. Second part of the year, they started bringing that second defender to his left-hand side, and he just wasn't reading that defender really well. That comes, obviously, with repetition. But his impact didn't match up with his production. Like, compared to his actual counting stats, he wasn't as good. Wasn't as good in the plus-minus categories. 0.99 points per spot-up possession because he kind of struggled to space the floor when he was off ball. 0.97 points per catch-and-shoot jump shot, so those numbers aren't good enough. He was a bit of a ball stopper, a little bit of a clunky fit on offense. And then on defense, a lot of really good moments, a lot of really bad moments. Typical for young players. Like, I talk about this all the time with young players. When it comes to replicating successes and diminishing mistakes, meaning like, oh, I fucked up. Let's try to not do that again. Or, oh, this is working. Let's keep doing it. Like, a lot of times young players will do something easy for a basket because of a simple basketball read. And instead of going back to it, they'll do something random on the next possession. Like veteran players, they'll spam something until it stops working. They know if I run this lane, if I set the screen and I slip out of it like this, if I move the ball quickly, it'll get its way back to me. Like all these like little details about how to replicate successes and minimize failures, they take time. That is a classic young basketball player issue. So the question is, how fast will Jonathan Kuminga make those progressions into being more of a winning basketball player? I'm not worried about his production. I think he averaged something like 16 points a game last year. If he averaged 16 points a game this year, that'd be great. Within the context of doing all of those little things more consistently and minimizing mistakes. And then lastly, can Steph return to form? Last 25 games last year, those of you guys who've been following the show, I've read these stats a million times, but Last 25 games last year, 22.8 points per game, 42% from the field, 38% from three. That's just not superstar production anymore out of Steph Curry. And it was part of the reason why they struggled against the top teams. The example I always use is that 2021 team. That was an equally limited, funky roster. But they went 10-15 against the top 10 point differential teams. That's a 40% win percentage. Whereas last year, they had a 30% win percentage against the top 10 teams. So Steph was able to lift them over the top for a 10% increase in win percentage based on his super duper star level of play. He was playing like the best player in the world in 2021. So how close can he get back to that form is going to be one of the major swing factors of this season. For the record, I believe he will. I think we're going to get a major bounce back season from Steph. I think he's too competitive. I think he knows his team needs him, and I think he knows what it takes. I have a feeling that when we get through 10 games or so of the year, Steph's going to be back up around 27 points per game on roughly 45% from the field and 40% from three. That's what I think we're going to get. And just like that, just that goes a long way towards returning this team to the middle of the Western Conference. So in summary, I think Golden State is firmly in the play-in picture again this year, but in a different way than last year. Last year, I thought they outkicked their coverage to barely scrape into the play-in. I think this is a better roster. I think they have more veteran role players that fit the scheme better on both ends of the floor. And I think Steph's going to be better. But I also think they're well positioned to make an aggressive move should the opportunity arise at some point this year. So for right now, they're a play-in team, but they have some real upside if they can get a deal done at some point this year. All right, last team for the day. At number 12, the Indiana Pacers. Not too much roster turnover. They lost Doug McDermott, lost Jalen Smith, brought in Cole Swider and James Wiseman. So basically trading out a bench wing that won't play and their third string center is basically all they did. So they're more or less running it back with the same roster as last year. But let's take a quick look back at last year because it's a confusing team in the sense that they have these really impressive metrics that also just didn't seem to really amount to anything when it was nut crunching time. So in the regular season, the five-man lineup of Tyrese Haliburton, Andrew Nembhard, Aaron Nesmith, Pascal Siakam, and Miles Turner, their starters. They had 922 possessions, according to Cleaning the Glass, plus 7.5 net rating. That's really good. They were actually very good defensively. They had a 108 defensive rating, and they rebounded really well. They grabbed 75% of their opponent's misses. That's a really good number. In the playoffs, 288 minutes played between those five guys, plus 14.1 net rating, a 129 offensive rating. Those are insane numbers in the large sample. But a couple of concerns popped up. One, their rebounding didn't hold. They gave up an offensive rebound on 31.2% of opponents' misses in the playoffs. That is bad. And then the big one, they got absolutely annihilated in clutch situations. They went 2-5 overall. Their offense got strangled. They went down to a 101 offensive rating when the game was within 5 points with at least 5 minutes left, or with less than 5 minutes left. 101. Think about that. Their offensive rating, I said earlier, was 129 with those five guys in the postseason in the large sample. So they were like really good until it got to the end of games, and then they could not score. And then their defense got thrashed too. For as good as their defense was in the large sample in the regular season, they had a 121 defensive rating in clutch situations in the postseason. And that's really the main reason why I'm lower on the Pacers than most people are. I think their regular season engine is real. Tyrese Haliburton is one of the best large sample offensive engines in the league. Does everything that I want in an offensive engine. Consistently throws kick-ahead passes in transition. Anytime somebody's open up the floor, he's throwing those kick-ahead passes. They're so valuable because defensive transition is always geared looking up the floor, looking back towards the ball handler. When you throw it over their head, they all turn to go identify where the ball is, and that opens up opportunities for trailers. It's also opportunities to attack and slash or get wide open threes before the defense is set. So like those kick-ahead passes are great. And then when he gets into the half court, he's just like an incredible playmaker out of ball screens. If you die on the pick or you duck underneath, he's a deadly pull-up jump shooter. If you die on the pick, but he gets downhill, he's a deadly floater shooter. If you switch the screen, he routinely toasted bigs in ISOs last year. And then he's one of the best passers in those situations that you'll meet. With the early phases when it was Buddy Hield and Miles Turner just picking and popping all season long and him just routinely hitting that guy wide open for a three, or when it was a lot more like traditional ball screens post deadline, he's reading Obi Toppin or Pascal Siakam out of the weak side corner whenever his man steps over to tag the roller. He just routinely made the right read every single time. It generated all these high efficiency shots for all of these players that, like, a lot of these players were mediocre players elsewhere in the league. Boston didn't want Aaron Nesmith. The Knicks had no use for Obi Toppin. These are guys that turned into like legitimate large role contributors for Indiana. Like Tyrese is the master at just getting defenses into rotation so that guys can capitalize on it. Siakam was a really nice fit that juiced him up on both ends of the floor. A lot of upside there. But when things slow down and get stuck in the half court and defenses are more attentive to detail and more physical on the ball and fly around in rotation better, they can struggle. Tyrese Haliburton shot 3 for 15 in clutch situations in the playoffs and had 7 turnovers to his 8 assists. Now, one thing I'll say is I thought that Tyrese, before he hurt his hamstring, had more athletic juice to get separation from elite defenders. And that's the case, right? Tyrese was so good in the clutch before he hurt his hammy. So, like, maybe that translates better at the postseason. But there is a certain amount of that, like, it really looked like they ran into a brick wall when they got into some intense playoff situations. Now, but Jason, they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals last year. I think a healthy Knicks team beats them in 5. And I think a healthy Bucks team beats them in 6. The Bucks were a tough matchup the Pacers were a tough matchup for the Bucks, and they gave them a lot of issues. But I think if Giannis and Dame are 100% healthy in full go for a playoff series, I think the Bucks probably get the job done. So, like, yeah, they made the conference finals, but they were extremely fortunate in getting there. So the question is, how can the Pacers enter into that next tier of teams? How can they get into that tier? Because, like, starting on Monday, I'm covering teams that legitimately have a championship ceiling if things go right. I don't think this Pacers team does. So how do they get there? I think they need an upgrade at the 2 or the 3. Aaron Nesmith and Adrian Nembhard are 2 really solid basketball players. And I think they are definitely championship level rotation players. But ideally, they should be coming off the bench for you. You need more high-level closeout attacking out of those spots, and you need better contested rebounding. This was a team that did not rebound well in the postseason. If you can basically imagine Aaron Nesmith, but like a 6'8" version of him with a little bit more off-the-dribble pop, I think just that, if you did a substantial upgrade to one of those 2 spots, I think that goes a long way. Like, kind of like what the Knicks did. Bringing in Mikal Bridges as an upgrade at the 3 dramatically increases their ceiling. A player of that type of caliber at the 2 or the 3, I think, moves the Pacers into those discussions. And they have the means to make that type of deal. They have a young player that doesn't seem to fit their long-term vision in Ben Mathurin. They have draft picks to spend. They have lots of mid-level salaries that can be combined to get to a higher-level player. And then the last piece of it is just Tyrese solving that playoff puzzle. He was a little bit weird in this playoff run. A lot of high highs, but a lot of low lows. He had 7 games where he didn't even take 15 shots. He had 4 games where he didn't even take 10 shots. There was like a little bit of like he either has it or he doesn't on this particular night kind of thing. And that's just part of the puzzle of the playoffs. You get attacked on the defensive end a lot, and on offense, everything gets way harder. And you have to maintain that consistency throughout that 4-round setup. Now, to be clear, the Pacers to me feel like the next great Eastern Conference Titan. Remember how like Milwaukee, Miami, and Boston kind of ran the East over the previous half decade? I feel like the Pacers are going to be in that type of group for the future. But I feel like they're one more roster shakeup and a little bit more player development away from actually making that a reality. So for this season, I just have them as the best team that doesn't have a real chance to win the title this year. at number 12. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting me and supporting the show. We'll be back on Monday getting into number 11 in our next tier of teams that can win the championship if things go right. I will see you guys then.